All right, Noah has told me that it is time to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of the Yale Law Ethics and Animals Program Speaker Series. This year's series theme, which is very well suited to the current moment, is One Health and is dedicated to exploring the ways in which our lives, immunologies, and dignities are interconnected with those of animals. A tremendous thank you to LEAP's Wonder team, Doug Kaiser, John Lavorne, Viveka Morris, and Noah Macy for your work to enable these conversations. As the pandemic has revealed, LEAP's work is not just philosophically interesting for students and academics, it is critically important for racial justice and global health. Thank you also to the organizational co-sponsors for today's event, the Yale Animal Law Society, the Yale Environmental Law Association, the Yale Sustainable Food Program, and the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration for helping with logistics and publicity. Today's event, which is titled Rampant COVID and AWOL OSHA, will examine the devastating impacts of COVID-19 for frontline workers in industrial meatpacking plants and the corporate and regulatory policies that enabled the virus to spread unmitigated. Meatpacking facilities are cramped and chaotic places in which thousands of workers stand shoulder to shoulder, assembly line style, with knives, saws, and other heavy equipment to process tens of thousands of animals every day. These conditions have facilitated some of the largest clusters of workplace infections in the country, which have been meticulously tracked and analyzed by Leah Douglas, who is here with us today. Similar outbreaks have also occurred at meatpacking facilities in Canada, Spain, Ireland, Brazil, and Australia. Slaughterhouses have long been sites of concentrated suffering for animals and workers alike. The industry's tremendous consolidation, coupled with minimal workplace protections, make meatpacking one of the most dangerous jobs in America. These risks have only been amplified under the Trump administration, which has advanced a corporatist deregulatory agenda throughout the food system. In 2018, for example, the USDA began allowing individual poultry plants to increase line speeds by granting waivers from the default safe speed rule. In 2019, the USDA began allowing corporate employees to replace federal food safety inspectors in swine slaughterhouses. And perhaps most notoriously, in April 2020, the Trump administration issued an executive order purporting to relieve meat industries of liability for the death and suffering caused by their negligent pandemic policies. In keeping with American tradition, the violence of the meatpacking industry is borne primarily by people of color. More than 80% of frontline meatpacking workers are Black and brown, more than half are immigrants, and nearly half live in families with incomes below 200% of the poverty line. In many respects, the crisis has revealed the awesome power and ruthlessness of the meat industry, which has deep ties to Washington and state capitals nationwide, but perhaps it has also revealed vulnerabilities. At the very least, it has reinvigorated alliances between workers, consumers, environmentalists, and animal advocates, at least for now. The promise of these connections, as messy and contingent as they may be, is at the core of LEAP's mission to produce positive legal change for animals, people, and the environment upon which they depend. And today we're going to hear from an amazing panel about a number of different ways that they and others are challenging the meat industry on behalf of frontline workers, as well as the significant legal and political obstacles that stand in their way. Before we move to the panelists, a few housekeeping notes. First, just to give you an idea of the agenda, each of our panelists will speak for about 6 minutes uninterrupted, and then the rest of the time will be reserved for conversation and Q&A. Second, and kind of to that end, if you have questions, please share them in the chat box, which is should be at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll hold off on asking questions until all of the panelists have spoken, but you should feel free to post them at any time during the event. Third, the event is scheduled to go until 1:30, but I'm told that depending on the flow of the Q&A, we may go a few minutes after. And fourth, this event is being recorded and will be posted on the LEAP YouTube channel in the next week or so. So if you'd like to share it with others or, I don't know, rewatch it over and over, now you know. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, journalist Leah Douglas, who has spent the last 6 months mapping the impact of the pandemic on food system workers. Leah currently works at the Food and Environment Reporting Network, and prior to Fern, she was a researcher with Open Markets Institute, where she studied consolidation and monopolization in agriculture. Today, Leah will speak to us about the experience of reporting on the recent outbreaks, including the challenge of collecting accurate data from this notoriously secretive and powerful industry.
Cool. Hey, everyone. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is it working? I'll take that as a yes.
It's working for me.
Okay, awesome, thanks. Great, so as was shared, so I've been mapping COVID-19 outbreaks and cases in the food system for about, since April 22nd, since early April, so for all the spring and summer, and essentially since the pandemic began. And I'm just gonna run through some of the trends that have come up in that work, some of the obstacles that I've encountered, and where we're sort of at today in terms of how the virus has spread has affected food system workers. One second. For some reason I am struggling to advance this. Okay, there we go. Great. So one of the first, if folks can remember way back to early April when we were first encountering COVID-19, in the food world, one of the first conversations that emerged was around the rapid closure of especially meatpacking plants where outbreaks of the virus were beginning and the virus was spreading. And especially in sort of early to mid-April, there were a number of closures of these facilities all over the country, reaching a peak of maybe 20 or 22 facilities that were closed around the same time. And the ripple effect of that was to create some bottlenecks in the supply chain and reduce the amount of meat processing capacity that could run through the system. And that raised some serious concerns about whether there was going to be a meat shortage, whether we would see similar trends in other sectors. And those concerns ended up not being particularly, not really playing out for a variety of reasons. But this is just to sort of contextualize where we were at the beginning of the pandemic. And you can see in this chart around on April 28th is when President Trump signed the executive order to evoke the Defense Production Act, which the effect of which was to essentially kickstart the reopening of these plants. So this was the first version of the map that I created in mid-April to sort of begin to understand how the virus was spreading in food processing facilities. And I came to this project knowing that the conditions at these plants are quite crowded. The workers in these facilities are already experiencing a number of workplace concerns, low wages, infrequent access to bathrooms and other sanitary facilities as a vulnerable workforce. And there have been so many news reports floating around about, different facilities closing or outbreaks spreading, but there was no sort of comprehensive database to understand, everything at once. So that was why I created this map. The first version had about 40 outbreaks on it. And it was just meatpacking plants, which are the sort of red-orange scale, and then food processing facilities, which in my, loose sort of categorization includes everything from, next stage meat processing, so making, sausage and deli meats and other types of finished products, or, things including fruit packing facilities and salad facilities and on and on. So there's a huge swath there of other types of smaller but still essential food processing facilities all over the country. So 2 months later, by mid-June, this was what the map looked like. At this state, there are about 300 facilities now on the map. There were an additional about 100 or so in my database, facilities that had outbreaks in the database that we didn't have specific information about where they were or what company they were associated with, so they aren't actually on the map. But you can see that, the virus is spreading very quickly in these types of facilities, and there are major, trends starting to emerge in the Midwest, particularly around the meatpacking industry there, and in the Pacific Northwest and West Coast with the intensive fruit and vegetable production there. So this was the map as of September 1st. It looks more or less the same this week. And I reoriented it a bit so that the scale of these outbreaks could be shown as well. So you can see that the biggest outbreaks by far have happened in the meatpacking facility in the Midwest, meatpacking sector in the Midwest. And then we've had just a huge number outbreaks as well on both of the coasts. And as of this map, I believe this is about 500 facilities, maybe 510 that are mapped, and there's about 900, more than 900 facilities now in my database that have had outbreaks. So during this time, we saw the really rapid expansion of cases among workers. So this is a line chart to give a sense for how that pacing has evolved. It's been really a very consistent climb since April, unfortunately. And we're starting to see the last few weeks, maybe something of a leveling off. It's hard to know, but this is showing how many cases were reported each day over this span. And this is just to give a sense for the total numbers. The cumulative total now is over 58,000 cases as of today. And this is among farm workers, food processing workers, and meatpacking workers. So according to just using CDC figures for how many meatpacking plants there are and how many workers in the sector, we can try to get a sense for how far the virus has reached. Almost 15% of meatpacking plants have had outbreaks, and according to my numbers, 8% of meatpacking workers. These figures are definitely an undercount. I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But just to give a sense for, the three biggest companies, substantial percentages of their workers have been sick. And the CDC released a report in July showing that nearly 90% of workers in these sectors are people of color. Oops, 1 second, there we go. So I just want to run quickly through a few different analyses that I did in the last few months to sort of contextualize some of this data. So this first story was looking at, in May, looking at the meatpacking plant outbreaks that existed at the time, trying to draw a connection between those facilities and the surrounding communities. And we can start to see emerging in this map a trend of, particularly in the middle of the country, when at the time we weren't seeing high numbers of cases, the areas surrounding meatpacking facilities are hotspots. And of course, now we know with several more months of information that there's absolutely a clustering effect that, when there is a hotspot, whether it's a university or a prison or a meatpacking plant, the surrounding community is affected. So this was sort of an early attempt to draw that connection. And there's been a few major obstacles in terms of collecting this information and trying to get, as accurate numbers as possible. So the reason that, I always give the caveat that these figures, though they are the most comprehensive figures available, are still an undercount, is that both the private and the public sector has been very reticent to share information about, the effect of the virus on workers. So I did a story a few weeks ago looking at, meatpacking plant companies' reticence to share any information about their own testing procedures and how many of their workers are sick. And at the time, JBS, Smithfield, and Tyson Foods, the three biggest meatpackers, which were responsible for about 40% of all of the COVID cases that I've counted, have basically had no comprehensive plan for further testing, had not released very much information about how many of their workers were sick, and had refused to participate even in a congressional inquiry into their practices along these lines. So there's a serious stonewall there that I'm sure we'll get into more in our conversation. And unfortunately, in the public sector, there's also been some serious obstacles. I did a survey of all 50 states trying to solicit more information about workers and COVID-19 cases in the food system directly from state health departments, and found that just 4 states were either regularly releasing or were willing to share upon request comprehensive data that included employer information, how many workers are sick by sector, and so on. And 2 of those states, Maine and West Virginia, have had, I think, 3 outbreaks between them in this sector in the whole pandemic. So the major contributors to the spread of the virus in the food system, including states like California, which folks might associate with more, transparent practices, unfortunately have not been willing to share information about how many workers are sick. So all that is to say, it continues to be a real struggle to try to get the best information, which can allow, advocates and policymakers to really understand the scope of this issue. All right, looking forward to any questions. Let me stop sharing. Great.
Hello, good morning.
All right, sorry, I wasn't sure if we were transitioning yet. Next, I will introduce our next speaker, Brent Newell, who is the senior attorney for the Food Project at Public Justice, which pursues strategic litigation targeting industrial animal agriculture. Prior to Public Justice, Brent worked at the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, which represents overburdened communities in California's Central Valley, and is where I actually was a summer intern this past summer. Currently, Brent represents poultry workers who filed a civil rights complaint with the USDA, alleging that COVID policies of industrial meat producers amount to racial discrimination. The complaint argues that by rejecting common sense public health guidance in favor of higher processing capacity, these employers have disproportionately harmed Black, Asian, and Latinx workers. Today, Brent will tell us about the mechanics of this legal argument and the challenge of bringing disparate impact cases against industry.
Well, thank you, Caroline. And I want to thank the other law students who organized this excellent panel, including Viveka and Noah. Really appreciate all your hard work. Also want to shout out and appreciate Leah Douglas and the excellent reporting that she's been doing. All the data has been essential given the amount of data suppression that's occurred during the pandemic. I'll share my screen now. So before I kind of launch in, I'd like to acknowledge the grassroots leadership, organizers, and worker justice organizations that Public Justice has the privilege to serve here. We represent the Food Chain Workers Alliance, of which Magali's group, Venceremos, is a member. We represent the Rural Community Workers Alliance based in Missouri, the HEAL Food Alliance, the American Friends Service Committee, Iowa, Idaho Organization of Resource Councils, and Forward Latino. These leaders and organizations have been organizing and working with workers, worker-based organizations. Workers are members of several of these organizations. And they've been working for justice in this corporate-controlled food system long before the pandemic began. And it's Public Justice's role in this civil rights complaint that I'm going to talk about to, ride shotgun, so to speak. Or as Dr. Robert Bullard says, lawyers serving grassroots groups and impacted communities should be on tap and not on top. So that's the way that we approach our work and our movement-oriented litigation. So the Food Chain Workers Alliance civil rights complaint, it tells a story of severe racial discrimination. It's occurring in this corporate controlled food system. And then more broadly, it talks about the institutional and structural racism that's present in 2020 America that compounds the discriminatory effects that are burdening frontline workers, most of whom are workers of color. 54 years ago, Congress passed and President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that was one of the most important legislative outcomes of the civil rights movement and an effort to effectuate those objectives to prevent racial discrimination. Fast forward to 2020, and I would hate to think what Dr. King would say, as I'm imagining him standing behind Lyndon Johnson signing that bill, to see what is happening, more broadly in America, but also what is happening in these corporate-controlled meat processing plants and how workers are subjected to racial discrimination. Because you see Title VI, which is part of that Civil Rights Act, it prohibits racial discrimination by any entity that gets federal money. Title VI tells agencies they have to prevent discrimination. And this administrative complaint was filed with a federal agency dispersing federal money. It was filed with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's not a complaint filed in court, and it says that Tyson and JBS have adopted COVID-19 policies that have the effect of discriminating on the basis of race. Oops. So Tyson, this is a picture of the Waterloo plant, has received over $100 million during the year 2020. And this plant in particular got contracts both before and after it closed in around the end of April, and then reopened again. JBS, the other entity that the complaint alleges is engaged in discrimination, has received over $45 million in USDA contracts during 2020. Now, the complaint was filed on July 8th, so several months ago. About a month later, the USDA rejected the complaint. The USDA said that these hundreds of millions of dollars of contracts did not have an objective of providing employment. We strongly disagree with that, we're evaluating the next steps. Of course, anybody who sort of studies the Farm Bill or the recent trade mitigation program, which are the two programs where this money comes from, knows that money isn't designed for feeding poor people purely. If it was, it would never pass or never become part of the policy. It's very much about supporting agriculture, including jobs in agriculture, and senators have said that out loud. So it is not, we strongly disagree with that rejection. So moving on, I want to talk about the core of the complaint. And if I go a little long, Noah, Caroline, please just cut me off, and we can address stuff during the Q&A session. So there's an adverse disparate impact occurring in meat processing facilities, and the complaint alleges that these two are engaged in that, specifically in that they have adopted policies that reject common sense protective measures, including an essential minimum 6-foot social distancing on the work floor, while workers are working, mostly on the production line as meat goes through these, highly efficient facilities. They're standing shoulder to shoulder, and they're not being provided that critical social distancing. That is important because it mitigates the risk of exposure. The denial of that means that workers are being subjected to that risk, and that has a discriminatory effect on the basis of race. The day before we filed the complaint, the CDC issued a key study, and that's what you see here. And it finds that while workers of color comprise the majority of, frontline workers on the floor in these facilities, they are contracting COVID at a rate disproportionate to their white coworkers. That is a disparate impact. That is a discriminatory effect prohibited by Title VI. In addition, the hourly workforces at these plants are a majority people of color, and management are majority white. ProPublica reports that, and they report the quiet part out loud. Smithfield CEO Kenneth Sullivan said, social distancing is a nicety that makes sense only for people with laptops. So white people get to social distance in these companies. People of color, the majority of whom are the hourly workers, are working shoulder to shoulder. Now, I mentioned the sort of broader institutional and structural racism issues that are compounding this discrimination. In 2020 America, majority of frontline workers are women. Many frontline worker sectors are majority people of color. Those, the data that the CDC reports show that Black and Latino people are significantly more likely to die from COVID-19 than white people. Moreover, Black and Latino people are significantly more likely to be hospitalized than white people. These racial disparities occur because of structural racism and institutional racism within this country. And it's imperative, as I wrap up this discussion of the complaint, it's imperative that federal agencies that are charged with administering federal money take action. It's imperative that Congress takes action. It's imperative that OSHA, which has totally refused to take action to protect essential workers, because this is not just a health and safety situation. This is not just subjecting people to unsafe working conditions. This is racial discrimination, and it must stop. Title VI said it must stop, and that was 54 years ago. So it's time for this to stop. And that's all I got to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Brett. Up next, we have Magali Licoli, who is the executive director of Venceremos, a worker-based organization that advocates for the human rights of poultry workers in Arkansas. Magali has been organizing workers in meat processing plants for over 6 years, during which she has observed the industry's routine violence and exploitation of labor up close. She has written powerfully about the asymmetry between the valorization of essential workers in corporate publicity and the deadly conditions that exist on the floor. Today, she will speak about the injustices that Venceremos members have confronted during the pandemic and describe how they and other workers are fighting back.
Hi, let me share my screen. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to share everything that we've seen on the ground. And we are very excited to share with you all what it's been for workers, all this struggle and fighting back during the pandemic. So my name is Magali Licoli, and I am co-founder and director of Venceremos. Venceremos is pretty much a new organization that was built by poultry workers and myself, but we've been organizing for over 5 years. So just to start, I think I want to really say that the working conditions before the pandemic were already catastrophic. And immediately when the pandemic began to be the issue, workers immediately identified the hazardous conditions of their workplaces. So whenever the pandemic began, or we saw as Leah was mentioning, the outbreaks happening back in March, and us being in Arkansas, we knew that that was coming to us too. So workers, first of all, they have never had paid sick leave. So workers are used to come to work while sick. And also because of the crowded conditions of the poultry facilities, it makes impossible to practice social distancing. So workers knew that they were at higher risk. And also because of the previous conditions that had led many workers injured for life, such as the high amounts of chemicals, many workers have respiratory problems. So that was a huge concern for them, because they knew that they were very vulnerable to COVID-19, and also to their families and the co-workers. So when we saw that the Trump administration began with the executive order giving releasing companies from any liability from workers, and pretty much the executive order really never stated that the plants need to remain open, but the government and plants used this message to tell workers that they were essential and they were the heroes to keep the food supply of the nation running. And so really they knew what they were doing. They knew that they were exposing workers to get sick. They knew, and all these companies, we began seeing the same patterns, such as giving incentives to workers, such as bonuses, telling workers that if they didn't miss any day of work, they will get $500 bonuses. And this happens at the Tyson plants, at the Smithfield plants in other states, because we were able to connect with workers from other states. And we learned that everything was pretty much the same conditions, and how the companies were forcing workers to come while sick. And so they were giving these 500 incentives to force workers to come to work in order to get those incentives. So workers were really frustrated back then, because back in March, or back in March, April, when we began seeing some cases, the companies were not providing the basic protective gear equipment, such as masks, any hand sanitizers. They were not providing that to workers. So we had to really organize with workers, and I want to talk a little bit more about that later, but we began organize workers demanding just the basic protection, such as masks. So whenever workers began hearing about the cases, the companies were suppressing that information from workers, meaning that workers from the meat packing were treated different than the rest of the workers from what any other industry say. And I want to say this because as of the Department of Health, whenever a worker tested positive for COVID-19, their work was to trace workers and to inform the workers or co-workers or the people who were close to those people that they were in contact to the person who got tested positive. Soon enough, the Department of Health in Arkansas knew that if they were gonna do the same with poultry workers, the poultry plants would have to be forced to shut down. So what they did basically was to suppress information to workers. So workers didn't know how many workers were testing positive. They didn't know if they were the co-worker or in what area. So workers began demanding that transparency, that they wanted to know how many cases were, and if they had to be in quarantine. And at the beginning, some cases began having to quarantine, and quarantine that they were never paid. They never paid workers to quarantine. And so then, as I said, soon enough that they learned if they were gonna put all workers to quarantine, the plants should be forced to shut down. So what they did pretty much was to let the companies do their own tracing. And so of course the companies never do the tracing. They never inform workers of how many workers were testing positive. And so pretty much they were purposely exposing workers to get sick, knowing that many of these workers could have died. And so really, after when we saw the outbreaks happening, the workers were very desperate. Many workers were sent to the hospital. Many workers have died, and there is no reports of the deaths of these workers. The Department of Health has refused to say how many deaths at each plant, so we don't know the number of that. Many of these workers died because of the pre-existing conditions of their respiratory problems, because of the high amounts of chemicals at the plants. Many workers that died were working over 10 years, 20 years at these plants, and they never got any compensation whatsoever. And so right now, with the conditions at the plants, really, the governor, the Arkansas governor was also protecting the companies, giving them any liability whatsoever from any COVID-19 case-related cases. And then they began really blaming the workers of getting sick outside. So they created this culture of like, you're getting sick because you're partying, because you went to the store. And really was just that they were working, the government and the meat packing plants together to really not protect workers. So what we learned after the companies were telling workers that they were the heroes, that they had to keep working because they had to keep the food supply going, we learned that in the month of April, 130,000 pounds, 130,000 pounds of meat were exported to China. And in this plant, the Berry Street plant where we were organizing, these workers were processing meat to export to China. And then eventually China had to cut the supply from that plant because of the high numbers of COVID-19 cases in that plant. So really we learned that the workers were really exposed to get sick for profits. It was never to keep going the food supply of the nation. And so then later we began organizing workers. There was a lot of necessity of workers to organize. And even though we couldn't meet in person, we had to organize these calls. Workers were very concerned, and over 300 workers from Tyson plants organized, came back together, made up petitions to demand the company the basic protections. And really, Tyson never listened to the workers. They never wanted to listen to the demands, because workers also knew the answers and they knew how to protect. We were demanding to restructure the workstations, and what Tyson did really was to place these partitions, but workers are still working shoulder to shoulder. It was impossible to practice social distancing because of the breaks were given at the same time. All the bathrooms were crowded at the same hours. So right now, after the outbreaks, many workers have died. Many workers are in hardship because the company didn't pay them during the times that they were sick, or it was very difficult to get access to the FMLA, or they were not paid to quarantine. And so right now, workers are struggling with bills, are struggling to get food on the table, and many of them are struggling with hospital bills and also funeral expenses. Many workers have died and nothing has been recognized of the essential work that these workers have done. And so we, as I said, we've been fighting back, organizing workers, and I think it's important for all of you to support grassroots organizations like Venceremos, to engage, to call on the USDA to stop the line speed increase, because also, despite all the efforts of workers fighting back, the line speed also has been increased to 174 chickens per minute during this pandemic. We saw that when workers were getting sick, some of the workers who remain at the plant had to keep up with the same production. Workers were sick, were tired mentally, physically, psychologically, and right now the conditions are getting worse because of the labor abuse. And right now the plants are not even talking about COVID-19 anymore because the outbreaks had happened, but workers know that they might be a possible second wave, and the company has relaxed already, and they are not talking whatsoever about the cases or any preventions whatsoever. So we are keep fighting with the allies outside Arkansas, and just to grow the worker power that it needs to be done in order to fight back what these companies are doing to these workers. And thank you so much. I think that's what I had to share. Or if I have.
Thank you so much, Magali. Finally, we're going to hear from Deborah Berkowitz, who is a lifelong advocate for worker safety, who served organized labor for many years before working as the chief of staff at OSHA from 2009 to 2013. Today, Debbie directs the Worker Health and Safety Program at the National Employment Law Project, which has done tremendous work to highlight how OSHA has failed to protect workers since the pandemic began. According to Debbie, the death and destruction we've seen in meatpacking facilities was not inevitable. And as a former OSHA official herself, there is no one who can speak more credibly to the gap between what the federal government could have done and the failures we've seen today.
Hi, I don't know if people can hear and see me. Can you hear me or? Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay. Hi,
and now
everybody.
I can see you.
Okay, great. Well, first I want to thank everybody for inviting me onto the webinar. It is more than great that all these programs at Yale have come together to focus on the harsh treatment of workers in meat and poultry plants. I've spent 40 years as an advocate for worker safety and health. Decades of my work as the Health and Safety Director of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union and at the AFL-CIO. focused almost solely on the meat and poultry industry, and I applaud your program for including worker safety in your portfolio. As you've heard, because of the structure of the OSHA law, which clearly must be changed one day, workers are not afforded a private right of action under the law. They don't have the right to sue on their own under the law when OSHA fails to enforce the law. It's very different than the Fair Labor Standards Act, for example. As a result, there are not many lawyers that have ever looked or been involved in worker safety, since there's no private right of action. So thank goodness for Brent and all his legal colleagues that have stepped into this fight in a major way. And thus I salute you at Yale and all your programs for holding this clinic and this webinar, and hoping all the Yale Law students listening will get inspired to join the fight to assure that no worker has to sacrifice their life for a paycheck. I also want to salute all the work of Magali and Aaliyah in exposing what's been happening because the numbers really that Leah has put forward are numbers that I use all the time. Since coming to NELP 5 years ago, after being in the Obama administration's OSHA, I've been working with unions, worker centers, community groups, and local officials around the country. And what I know is that the meat industry as an entire industry has decided they weren't going to implement lots of the CDC guidance during this pandemic on how to prevent the spread of this deadly disease. Most importantly, as you've heard, they were not going to implement social distancing. In fact, you've already heard that the corporate executive of Smithfield Foods, one of the largest meatpacking companies, had already wrote letters to governors saying that social distancing is a nicety that makes sense only for people with laptops. So the industry decided not to protect workers, and then they asked this administration to aid them in keeping their plants open, even when the disease spreads through their plants. COVID-19 has spread and continues to spread like wildfire through meat and poultry industry and through their communities. And it is aided and abetted by this administration and governors that support this administration. The industry asked for an executive order from the president. That the executive order was issued, and it seemed to say that county health departments could not close plants down even when there's an outbreak. Though the executive order actually did not say that. It did not confer any power to any agency to keep plants open. And it did not prevent public and local health departments from closing down plants. But it worked because the industry tells county health departments, you can't close this down. There's this executive order. Just now in California, where they just closed a meatpacking plant, a poultry plant for an outbreak. It's reported in the press that the industry and the USDA said that the executive order said that county health departments can't close them down, when that's just not true. I want you to know how different the meat industry is than any other industry. Unlike other industries like the auto industry that have huge assembly lines and developed a safe and science-based strategy for reopening that includes masks, social distancing on production lines and in break rooms and other measures, the meat industry was not prepared for this pandemic, nor was it willing to rearrange its plans to keep workers and their communities safe. And the federal government backed them up. It's not rocket science to figure out how to protect meat and poultry workers from COVID-19 exposure in the workplace. It wasn't inevitable, as you heard, that COVID-19 would spread in these plants. If the meat industry had followed the basic guidance of masks and social distancing and assuring ventilation systems were maintained and stepped up sanitation and ability to wash hands, the spread of COVID-19 would have been mitigated in these plants. But the industry decided not to implement much of this guidance. The CDC also issued very dangerous guidance, and I believe they did this on behalf of the meat industry, that allowed, if you were an essential worker, that said that if you were exposed, your company could require you to go back to work. For most of us, if we are exposed, including all you students at Yale, you will be asked to quarantine for 14 days or until you test negative. But if you're an essential worker, CDC at the beginning of April said, if you're an essential worker, a company could require you to go back to work. And though the meat industry did not follow most of CDC guidance. They decided to follow this one. In fact, the Denver Post reported that JBS, one of the big meatpacking plants that was just closed as this guidance was issued, called the Vice President Pence and asked him to have the head of CDC call the health department in Colorado to make sure that JBS would be allowed to bring back exposed workers. And it's because they brought back all these exposed workers, and you know, there's significant spread among pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals, that I believe it is spreading like wildfire through these plants. I also want to just summarize briefly the federal government's complete failure to protect workers in this pandemic. OSHA, the agency I worked for 6 years and who had a very different response to the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, has completely abdicated their responsibility and their mission to protect workers. OSHA's job is to assure that employers provide safe conditions to prevent injuries and illnesses, but they decided not to enforce the law. The agency did not respond to complaints from terrified meatpacking workers all over the country. They didn't respond with inspections. They simply sent the company a letter. They were like an advice columnist and told them to investigate themselves. And then they closed the case. And in so many cases in meat and poultry, even when OSHA got complaints that workers were throwing up in the plant because they were sick and there was no social distancing, OSHA refused to inspect. And then there were huge outbreaks and workers got sick and workers died in these plants and there was risk to the community. I want you to know that last year, 2000, the last time BLS reported statistics, there were a total of 10 workers killed in the meat and poultry industry total nationwide. Now that number is at least 20 times as high in just 6 months. So the agency in charge of protecting workers, as you've heard, has barely done any on-site inspections at all. And not only haven't they enforced the law, but OSHA has also issued no requirements for employers to implement to protect workers from COVID-19. Though they were petitioned by hundreds of organizations and the AFL-CIO and even sued, they did not issue a single requirement that employers must implement to protect workers from COVID-19. And they decided not to enforce any C guidance. Further, CDC is not even requiring or collecting any information on any work-related exposure or deaths. And I want to restate what you already heard, that this industry has been built on the backs of Black and brown workers. And these communities also face disproportionate rates of serious illness and death related to COVID-19, stemming from structural racism over generations related to access to healthcare. Thank goodness some states have stepped forward to protect workers. Virginia just passed an emergency standard, and about 12 other states have done some things, but that's only a handful. And lastly, I want to add that while OSHA has buried their heads in the sand and decided not to protect workers in this pandemic, including those most at risk like meat and poultry workers, the USDA has actually tried to make things worse for workers, increase injuries and risk to COVID-19 by allowing companies to speed up their production lines. So with that, I think I'll end and happy to answer any questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And thank you to all of our panelists. I have a couple of questions to start us off, but to everyone else who's listening, please continue to post your questions in the Q&A box. They're kind of scattered between the Q&A box and the chat window right now, but I'll do my best to consolidate some of them. I guess drawing on a couple of conversations or questions from the audience that we've gotten so far, and this is kind of for anyone, why have we seen this level of disregard from the federal government and from state governments? Is it just a matter of corruption, of industry lobbying? What accounts for the failures of corporations and of agencies to take workers' safety seriously? Go ahead, Debbie.
I think this is very specific to this administration. So I have been doing this work since I'm really old, since 1979. I've been through the Reagan administration, who ran on a platform of getting rid of OSHA. But thank God that didn't happen. And even he went after bad actor industries. They slammed, for example, the meatpacking industry with some of the highest fines ever issued to any company. I think that this is an administration that that's in, you know, in the pocket of the meat industry. The meat industry is incredibly politically powerful. I urge you all to read Jane Mayer's article about the poultry industry a couple of weeks ago, which I think sort of will help explain it. But the meat industry, it turns out, is exceptionally powerful. It totally runs states like North Carolina and other states. And I think this administration has decided to do whatever it asked. And it is stunning to see OSHA fail like this. That has never happened before. And also CDC has been very politicized. And I think news will be coming out shortly of how they let the meat industry sort of write their guidance. So the guidance now says, if possible, if feasible, consider this. So I think that this is really, folk, you know, that it is so horrible now because of the, you know, who's in power.
Yeah, I just want to echo, can I?
Go ahead, we could hear you, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Debbie says, because it's really true. Like in Arkansas, Tyson and Walmart has so much power over the state that really the state does whatever Tyson tells them to do. So when we saw that happening, we saw that the government was protecting the companies over the people, and that was very clear. How the governor stand up and kept saying that the companies were doing everything that they could to protect workers, when we knew that they purposely were risking workers to get sick. Just want to say that.
I would just add too, one of the things that has been interesting for me during this experience is because the meatpacking issue has been covered so extensively in the media, it's like more spotlight on these issues than I've seen in my career. I haven't been doing it very long, but or as long, but I think one of the things, I've spoken with a lot of reporters who are really appalled by just like the amount of industry influence in agriculture in particular. And I think there are, of course, many industries that wield a lot of power over the regulatory process and over policymakers, but the farm sector is so underexamined and has been for so long that I think the companies are just accustomed to doing whatever they want, essentially, and there's very little scrutiny or oversight, which is not to discount like the incredible advocacy work and the media that does exist, but there's just a certain, even, it's not, this happened under Obama as well, where, there is a sort of status quo where it's a default industry friendly, even if there are, adjustments made over time. So I think there's, when, for instance, a good example of this is the congressional inquiry that was opened by Senator Warren and Senator Booker into the meatpacking industry to try to get some more information about, why this has happened, why there are so many cases and outbreaks, and all the companies that were asked to provide data just said, no thanks, which when I shared that with people who were not familiar with the field, they were like, you can do that? And it's like, yeah, if you're Tyson Foods, you can do that. So I think that is a trend that, I've tried to draw out in my work as well.
I do want to say one thing, and that is I was in the Obama administration, and it was very different. We went after the meat and poultry industry for OSHA, but also the USDA is run, people should know, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is run by the meat and poultry industry. That is who runs it, that is who they answer to. That they did try to increase line speeds in poultry plants, and the Obama administration said, no, it's too dangerous for workers. And that's very different than this administration, which has just allowed line speed increases in swine slaughter plants. So it's being challenged. Just gave like 15 companies just in April, tell them increase your line speeds, just waive the requirements of the law that's existing, and just announce that they're going to try to pass a rule really quickly to let poultry plants increase line speeds, which is, and for people to know that meat and poultry already have incredibly high injury rates, that the pace of work is so fast that workers don't usually have the ability to go to the bathroom even once during the day, because the meat comes so quickly they can't get off the line. There aren't workers to replace them. So I just thought I'd say that.
Thank you all. And so staring down some of these structural or almost inherent problems in the current industry, what opportunities do you all see, if any, for consolidating all of the energy and focus that Leah just mentioned into bigger picture durable change in the food production system?
I'll take a first stab at that, Caroline. So first of all, the power of people, the power of organizing that is happening right now is building a movement that is demanding change and is empowering people. That's the first thing. And supporting those on the ground institutions that are doing the organizing, that are building power, is a key strategy that funders and that advocates should embrace. The second thing is in Congress, there are several leaders who are pushing key systemic reform, and there are bills moving forward. You know, as the other panelists noted to the prior question, you know, there's one party that is pushing for corporate immunity, that is pushing to protect corporations from workers. There's another party that is moving legislation to reform the food system to protect workers. I'm talking about Senator Booker's Farm System Reform Act. I'm talking about the Every Worker Protection Act that has been advanced that would require OSHA to adopt emergency standards. I'm talking about the key environmental justice bills that have been introduced by Congressman Bobby Scott, by Senator Harris, by Senator Booker, and there's another bill in the House that I can't remember, but those would reform Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to give people who are suffering from discriminatory effects, like we've alleged in this Title VI civil rights complaint, the right to go to court and get a judge to grant relief and order Tyson and JBS to reform themselves so that they would not be subject to the whims of the USDA in administrative complaints. So there are opportunities for systemic change and to address these issues. And that, I'm not trying to say that's the exclusive universe of it, but it starts with organizing and building power. And there are champions in Congress to help those community-based organizations.
So a lot of this is, you know, what happens to Congress for all of you out there in the election. I think it makes a big difference. There's the Protect American Workers Act that would give workers, if they're fired or retaliated on the job for speaking up about health and safety, a right to sue, which they don't have right now at all. So, I mean, the OSHA law really needs to change. I think this pandemic exposed the weakness of the law, that it's all that OSHA has, all that workers have is OSHA, and if OSHA fails, there's nothing. But I also want to challenge you all as individuals about where you get your meat and poultry from, and ask if it's coming from these big plants, and do you really want to support them? I think the industry has to hear from consumers that this is not acceptable, that they must lift labor standards. These are billion-dollar companies. They don't have to run their plants like this. So I just sort of challenge you all to think about that.
Yes, and I want to add to that, because it's true that for us, it's been the opportunity to grow worker power, and to the opportunity, because it's been knowing that it's very hard to organize poultry workers because of they are afraid of organizing and speaking up, because the majority of them are very vulnerable workers, refugees, immigrants, Blacks. And so right now we are really using the opportunity to bring workers together, because there is the need of organizing workers, and also to connect the need and to bring the consumers and the public, because it's true, like we need to reconnect where is our food coming from and how the food is being processed. Well, we just filed an FTC complaint against Tyson because they are misleading consumers in the ads of saying that they are a safe work environment. Tyson replied back saying that consumers, they never take into consideration how workers are treated in order to buy their products. And so I invite you to really put pressure, because that's not really truth. I think we need to grow the consciousness on the people and the power of the people to buy those products, and to say, I'm not gonna buy this product if you are gonna be treating workers like this. You know, if we are going to be talking about sustainability, we need to bring the labor piece on there, because it's not sustainable how they are treating these workers. So as Venceremos, we want to build a worker-driven social responsibility model in the poultry industry, in which we create a code of conduct that is going to be adopted by the supply chain, using that purchase power, but at the same time to connect with the public, to use that purchase power to put pressure into these companies to do what they need to do to protect these workers. We cannot continue like this, and we're gonna take this opportunity to move forward and to build a program that will bring changes to these workers.
Great, thank you all so much. On the heels of that conversation, I'm gonna take this question from the Q&A. Given that violence and exploitation seem to be inherent aspects of animal agriculture, whether in the mental and physical health of laborers, neighboring communities, the environment, and animals, what sorts of policies should these organizing efforts emphasize? Should we focus on marginal modifications, or should we aim to opt out of animal agriculture in its entirety?
So I can start here. I think, I mean, you've all read the Omnivore's Dilemma, clearly. And earlier on, I did a Facebook or a FaceTime, or no, Facebook something or other. Yeah, sorry. With Senator Cory Booker and Michael Pollan, the author of Fast Food Nation, that I'm not blanking on, but that sort of addresses some of this. But I think, you know, change comes in increments. And I think what's really important is that in all the work that I've been doing, most people don't even think about the workers in these meat and poultry facilities. They just don't think about them. And I remember the sheriff in Waterloo, Iowa, where 1,000 out of 2,800 workers got sick with COVID and many people died. He was telling us in a webinar I was on with him that he never even thought about, like, this plan. Who's in this plan? It was mostly immigrant and refugee workers, but you know, he knew there was a John Deere plant in his, where there was, that he knew about. Like people, these plants are hidden. And so when he went in there, he was shocked to see what it's like to go into these plants and the conditions that people have to work under, and they're really harsh. And these plants have between 50 and 100% turnover, even when they're unions. So I think that we need to exercise our power as consumers to help support workers, to provide funding for groups like Venceremos that barely get any funding. We have to think about where we buy the meat. We have to communicate with the industry. They're incredibly powerful. And we need to think about, as we vote, what issues are important to all of us.
I'd like to briefly answer the question. I think it's important to draw a distinction between corporate controlled agriculture and farmers. They're not the same. Many farmers support racial justice. They support the workers that are in these plants. I'm talking about the National Farmers Union, the Wisconsin Farmers Union, the Iowa Farmers Union, the Iowa Farmers Union, and farmers are important and fabric of the rural economy. To say no to animal agriculture entirely, it ignores the inherent ability to create alliances across movement sectors and to build power. Farmers want to see justice. Farmers want to, many farmers want to achieve the goals that we're talking about. and that includes ranchers and small dairymen. And they're the victims of corporate oppression in the same, not the same way, but in a similar way. You know, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue told struggling, going out of business dairy farmers in Wisconsin that it's tough luck, it was get big or go out. So what the problem here is the corporate controlled system that's dominated by these giant corporations like Tyson and JBS and Smithfield, and policies that support farmers and allow cross-sector movement, power building, and organizing is in the opinion of the Public Justice Food Project, more advantageous than saying get rid of animal agriculture altogether.
Great. So what are the best ways for us as consumers or as people who aren't working in our day jobs on these issues to support workers, to support the change that we want to see in this industry?
I think I said before, and I think it's great, is you think about the choices of the consumer. I mean, the reason why a lot of meat doesn't have antibiotics in it is because of consumers. So if you want to care about workers, I think also maybe think about it, and because you're at a university, and I know Georgetown University has a project, you know, think about using your procurement power of where you're getting your meat and poultry from. What are conditions of the workers in those facilities that you're getting this from? I know there's always a middle person. You know, think about how you can, just in the university, use your own power to lift labor standards in this industry. And I'm happy to connect you all with folks at Georgetown Law that are working on something like this. Are these plants running their line speeds faster than normally allowed? Or, you know, are there local sort of smaller, you know, meat and poultry facilities that don't have these huge slaughterhouses that you can support? You know, can you also, you know, make sure your representatives know that you care about these issues, and make sure that, you know, they pass a bill to protect workers. I mean, right now the Senate is debating a bill that would give corporate immunity, that with no standards, no requirements for any employer to have to protect workers. You know, in the state of Virginia, in Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, California, New York, New Jersey, you know, some of these governors have moved forward to really protect workers and packing house workers. And can we get more of that on the state level? And, you know, things like that. I know you all are studying and will become brilliant lawyers, but, you know, there are things like that that you can do. And of course, donate to groups like Magali Bonsameros too.
Yes, I think it's very important to support grassroots organizations that are leading the work, and to create spaces for us to talk or to bring workers to share their testimonies, to grow that consciousness in workers and consumers, because sometimes we are so disconnected that we don't believe or we don't know what the stories are happening inside those plants. So I think it's very important to create spaces for the workers to share their testimonies and to also follow the leadership of those workers or those organizations who are trying to implement a program that is going to bring market consequences to those plants who are not following the code of conduct that we want to implement. And also, it's so important, the implementation of that code of conduct that will assure those changes. So I think it's very important for people to support Venceremos, because we need a lot of resources to bring that program like that to systemically change the industry.
Great. I have a question specifically for Leah. I know that you have worked on consolidation and antitrust in the past. Are there possible levers there for addressing some of the problems that we see in animal agriculture and meat?
Yeah, sure. There's plenty. You know, it's sort of the backdrop of the pandemic. There's actually been some pretty significant investigations going on within the Department of Justice. Is one looking at consolidation issues in the meat sector. Sort of, you know, well, anyway, it's been an interesting time to see the major movement on those issues happening right now. It's a little bit connected to the pandemic. It's also, there's some litigation that's been going on for years related to how poultry and beef companies in particular are monopolizing the sector. So there is actually, you know, some movement going on there. There's been a few indictments in the poultry sector of company executives for colluding. You know, I think that there's a connection there to the pandemic and treatment of workers insofar as, you know, the more powerful these companies are, the more of a block they can become to apply pressure on regulators and to, you know, to weaken some of these protections we've talked about. And it's also, you know, there are also specific remedies that need to be applied for, you know, the specific crisis that we're in. I think the levers of antitrust, while powerful, are significantly, you know, slower in terms of if there's going to be, you know, a major, this one specific investigation, for instance, that's been going on in the Department of Justice has been underway for over a year, you know, sort of no end in sight. And it's very non-transparent, you know, at what stage it's at and what factors are being considered. So I think in terms of, you know, addressing the issues that we're talking about today, there's more immediate remedies, but there is, you know, there's been a lot of conversation and has, you know, as all these conversations originated in grassroots organizing among workers and among farmers, you know, to try to draw these connections for us to show how that consolidated power has this negative impact down sort of every step of the supply chain.
Great, thank you. I'm told we have time for one more question, so I think to end, we're going to do a kind of a rapid fire, go down the line, and just ask for everyone if you could change one thing, if you could implement one concrete reform in either meatpacking or in the food system more generally tomorrow, what would it be? I'm going to give you a second to think. And then we'll just go left to right across the screen that I have. So we're going to start with Debbie.
Right now, in COVID, prevent, put a policy in that any exposed worker be quarantined with pay until they test negative in meat and poultry.
Great. Next, Brent.
Well, that's pretty hard to pick one. I'm going to have to go with immediate and significant action to mandate all CDC required measures to protect workers, including social distancing, temperature checks, the whole 9 yards, and reduce processing rates so that workers can spread out in the plants and achieve social distancing to mitigate fully the risk of COVID-19 exposure.
Great. Leah, next.
Well, continue what I was talking about earlier related to data reporting and sharing. You know, I think if we could mandate that every state, every county, and every company had to share the information they had about how many workers have been sickened by the virus and how many outbreaks there have been, I think we would be shocked by the results of that. So if I could snap my fingers, that's what I would have.
All right, and finally, Magali.
Well, this is very hard to answer with just one, but I think that it's very important to reduce the line speed so workers don't keep harming themselves, and also to allow more to practice social distancing. I think that's very important, and the transparency of the cases at the plant so workers know, and as Debbie and everybody said, I think all of that is so important.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists and to everyone who participated today. Sorry we didn't get through more of your questions, but as I mentioned in the beginning, this will be posted online in the next couple of weeks. And otherwise, stay tuned for more exciting conversations from the LEAP project or the LEAP program throughout the rest of the year. Thanks so much.
Thank you.